So, guys, tonight we are back in our study as soon as I pull it up here. And man, I'm looking forward to it, man. I've been excited about it all day and can't wait to get into it tonight. So, as you can see, I do have a microphone on tonight, and that is because Andy's been working hard to get us back up with our ability to record and to post all of our sessions for our series. And so tonight, as of tonight, this will be available later on, so you can share with your friends or whatever you got to do for our worship tonight and catch up on all that good stuff. So we started a series last week called Even Though, right? Even Though. And if you can make out the little words behind it, right, it says joy. Everybody say joy. Good, you got to say it like I say it, man. It's no fun, right? And so, right, we've been talking about having joy even though life is difficult. And so what we did is we kicked off this series last week with our first session in the first 6 verses of Philippians. And what we discovered is that it's written by the Apostle Paul, right? We talked about all this context, all of this stuff, right? We talked about when it was written and where it was written and all of that fun stuff. And essentially what we bottled down last week was this, is that even in the midst of a difficult life, we can find joy in faithfulness. And we looked at that, and we looked at what the Apostle Paul said about faithfulness and the faithfulness to commune with God in prayer, the faithfulness of community with God's people, faithfulness on God's part to work in our life. We talked about how we found joy in that. And so tonight we're going to pick up the second session, and it's going to be in verses 12 through 18, and I've entitled it Some Good News. Some good news. Has anybody seen this recent YouTube show called Some Good News by the one and only John Krasinski? Anybody seen it? Ish. Yeah, Jim Halpert, right? Yeah, that works too. Or Jack Ryan, I guess any of you Amazon Prime people, I don't know. Right, John Krasinski. Man, here's what happened. It's actually pretty awesome. If you have time, or even if you don't, when you just get lost on the back alleys of YouTube, right, stumble upon this, it'll be worth it, I promise, right? Go check it out. What happened is during the pandemic, when COVID-19 hit earlier this year, and everybody was on lockdown at their homes, right? John Krasinski made an idea. He's like, you know what? I'm going to make basically a video podcast of good news, right? Pretty straightforward, hence the Some Good News. And so here's what he would do each week. He would actually get on there and he would share awesome stories from around the world or around the country regarding like encouraging things, right? It would be like one couple, they had planned a trip to Paris, and they were gonna get married or something there, but instead, obviously COVID shut it down, so he does something for them and he'll put something on. He throws a prom for some high school students, and he gets the Jonas Brothers to play all this stuff, right? Billie Eilish, all this stuff. He does some really incredible stuff on the show. But the point was this, man, he realized this, that in the midst of this pandemic, when everything was shut down, everything was honestly pretty discouraging there for a while. Do you guys know what that's like? You know what it's like? You know what I'm talking about? There was a month span where every couple minutes, I was checking my phone to see what was developing with this thing, right? Because it kept getting scarier or worse. It kept getting more intense, all sorts of stuff, right? And there was a time span where people were pretty afraid. And the reality is this, there was a whole lot of bad news everywhere. And so his idea was simple. He said, you know what, in a world of bad news, listen guys, he said, I'm gonna try to give some good news. Why? Because a little bit of good news can go a long way, right? A little bit, you've been there, had a bad day, and someone shares something really awesome with you, and it changes everything, right? A little bit of good news can go a long way. In a world of bad news, good news can keep us going. And so here's where we're getting to tonight, man. As you guys know, if you've been in church for any amount of time, you know that the Bible talks about good news, right? And it has a word for it. What's that word? The gospel, right? Sunday school answer, it's okay. Wake up, guys, stay with me, right? It's called the gospel. And in case you don't know what that is, let me go ahead and just briefly catch you up. The gospel is the testimony of what Jesus has done for us. right? It is the good news. And by that we mean this. It is the good news that although you and I are sinners, although we've been separated from God, that Jesus came, right, lived a sinless life, had an awesome ministry, died a sacrificial death on our behalf, and now offers us life because he resurrected with power, right? That's the good news. It's the testimony of Jesus. And so here's what I'm getting to tonight. Life is full of bad news. But for the Christian, listen, we always have good news. And this good news is something important because here's the truth of it. The good news that I'm talking about is actually the supreme news. It is something that reigns over all of it. It's something that overshadows everything we go through. This good news is supreme in all things. Like, Austin, that sounds cool. You said supreme, and that made me think of like Taco Bell, right? Anybody else? Nope, just me? Okay. That's okay, right? Struggles of a food lover, right? And here's what I'm getting to tonight, man. When we jump into this passage, we're going to see that the gospel, the good news, it does a few things in Paul's life. And listen, man, I'm really excited about it. I thoroughly enjoyed breaking down this passage. And I promise if you stay with me tonight, it'll be worth it. So let's hang tight and let's get into Philippians chapter 1. Again, let me just kind of recap 2 or 3 major things about the context, right? Philippians was written by who? Paul. Everybody say Paul. You guys are dead, man. Wake up a little bit, right? It was written by Paul to the church in Philippi, also called the Philippians, right? That wasn't a trick question. It's just you added Ian's on it. It's okay. Right? Yeah, the Philippians. That's who he's writing to. And do you guys remember what I said last week was the theme of this book? Joy. It's joy. And it's crazy. And here's why it's crazy, right? I established it last week. It's crazy that it's joy that in these 4 short chapters, right, he talks about it at least 16 times. And it's crazy because when he's writing this, he is in prison, right? Like the dude can't go anywhere, right? Like life is not looking up for him at this moment in time. And yet the only thing he can really talk about is joy. And that doesn't make any sense. Right? Obviously, Paul knew something about joy that goes over, right? It transcends any circumstance, and we talked about that. We talked about how we have something to hold on to even in changing times, right? That joy is not subject to change. And so tonight, what we're going to find is this, man. We skipped a couple of verses. We're going to pick up in verse 12, and here's what happened. Paul has basically ended his opening remarks. Anybody ever like make phone calls? There's this one person that always calls me, and they never say, hey, hello, how's it going? They just get straight to it. You know what I mean? It's like I pick up the phone and they're like, and they're like, you want to get lunch? And I'm like, who are you? Right? It's just really weird. It's like, I need a little bit more, right? Tell me who you are. Tell me why you're riding. Not riding. You're calling. That's like old school, right? But that's essentially this like greeting period. That's essentially what we're going to jump over the rest of. And here's what Paul he said. He said, hey guys, the church in Philippians, I love you guys. I miss you guys. I wish I could be with you guys. I'm praying for you. And then it gets to some of the heavier stuff. And that's where we're going to pick up tonight in verse number 12. And really with this change of focus, there's a change of tone, right? He went from one that was like really cordial, really friendly to one that's like, hey, I need to tell you some stuff, okay? We need to talk about some stuff. So that's what's going to happen in verse number 12. And I'm just going to give you a short outline. Well, it's not short-ish. It's brief, it's quick, it's easy, about what Paul says about the good news. And listen, how it transformed his life. And so, the first thing we're going to see is this, is that the good news, in verse number 12, this is big, man. It dictated his perspective. Okay? You're like, Austin, I thought we were talking about joy. Hold on, we'll get there. All right? We'll get there in a second. The first thing we're going to find is this, is that for Paul, the good news, the gospel, it dictated his perspective, how he saw things. Check out verse number 12 with me. If you're there, say, I am there. I am there. Okay, the rest of you guys need to get there because we're going, man. Verse number 12 says this. Paul says, but I would that you should understand, brothers or brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel. Right? Let me summarize the King James for you. Paul says, hey, I want you guys to understand that everything that's happened to me, Everything that's going on in my life, everything I'm struggling with, I'm wrestling with, it's actually happened to further the gospel. It's actually a good thing, right? That's what he's saying. He said, I recognize that what I'm going through actually has good ends, that God is doing something with it. There's a couple things I want to point out. The first thing is this word furtherance, right? Anybody use that this week? Furtherance? Didn't think so. But it's actually really cool. It is the Greek word prokope. Everybody say prokope. Prokope. And it essentially means this. It literally means advancement, okay? And it was mainly used in terms of military advancement, right? When they would break through a wall or whatever and push through the front, right, as an advancement. That's what it was mainly used for. However, in its noun form, I love this. It actually means cutting down in advance of. All right? So think of an explorer, right? You guys remember Tarzan, okay? He's not the explorer, don't worry. Right? When everybody shows up and they start marching through the jungle, they carry what with them? Machete. Whoa, she was on top of that, right? She's like, my Tarzan game's on point. Okay, they carry a machete, right? And what do they use it for, right? They use it to cut down stuff in their way, right? Thank you for the demonstration. They use it to cut down stuff in their way, right? They cut down leaves or brush or really tall grass or whatever. They cut this stuff down as they are making their way through the jungle, right? It's literally, they are cutting this stuff down so they can get somewhere. That's what Paul is saying. He's saying, hey, the stuff that's happened to me, it is, in a way, it has prepared the furtherance of the gospel, right? In the same way that someone cuts down the leaves to get where they're going. That's what God is doing in my life. This has had to happen, right? This had to happen for the furtherance of the gospel. You're like, apparently that doesn't impress you. That blows me away, and I'll show you why in just a second. But I also want to point out this about the first part. He says this, I want you to understand, brethren, right? I love saying brethren just for the fun of it. It's, I don't know, just use it, okay? Don't judge me. He says, I want you to understand, brothers, right? And here's what that shows us. That shows us this, that what he's doing here, this first sentence is a sentence of clarification. And here is why. He wants them to understand this, that the perspective that he is sharing, look, the perspective that he is sharing is not popular, right? It is not popular, and it is not obvious. Meaning this, okay? What are you going to think when you find out that your good buddy is thrown in jail for absolutely no reason other than telling people about Jesus? You're going to be upset about that, right? That's what we do. We get upset about stuff like that. But Paul says, back up, guys. I want you to understand that God is doing something. He is clarifying for them his perspective, right? They would initially think, man, this is terrible. This is bad. Who wouldn't think that? But he said, hold on, back up. God is doing something more, right? He's correcting their understanding because, listen, his perspective has been entirely changed. And here's where I'm getting to, man, and this is big, and I hope you guys will stay with me. You see, Paul's perspective was this. Everybody listen real close. He was willing to suffer as long as the gospel pushed forward. That was his perspective. He said, look, guys, I know you think that this is terrible. I know you think it's bad, but it's actually serving good. God is using it. He had learned to see his circumstances through the lens of the gospel. He realized that even in his suffering, the gospel was going forward, and he was content in that. Actually, no, he rejoiced in that. He rejoiced in that. And here's where I'm getting, man. Let me ask you this. In your own life, answer this honestly. What is it that dictates your perspective? What is it that you see everything else through? Answer that honestly. Because if you're like me, I probably can guess at least one of the highest answers, if we're honest. You know what it is? Convenience. Convenience is how most of us see most of the circumstances in our life. How convenient is it for me? Is it inconvenient? Then I don't want it. We're a people of convenience, right? And I love that Paul saw through that, right? And what he did was this. Listen, he saw opportunities for the gospel rather than just inconveniences toward himself. And this teaches us something, man. The reality is this. Gospel opportunities often come at the expense of personal convenience. Meaning this, that to see God work in incredible ways, we're going to have to get a little uncomfortable. We're going to have to be willing to go to some situations that we really wouldn't be normally. Right? You know what I mean? And let me give an example of this, okay? Let me get on a soapbox for a second. Face masks. Uh-oh, Austin said it. Okay? Anybody in here love wearing a face mask all the time? Oh, I didn't really expect any hands to go up. Nobody likes wearing them all the time, right? Hard to breathe. I have contacts, right? And so it just like makes my contacts get all dry and like sticks to my eyeballs, right? Like I hate it. It's no fun, right? The face masks are no fun. But here's the reality, right? The world has been watching how Christians respond to that. They have. And here's the truth of it. So many Christians have responded with an attitude of saying, I'm not doing that because it doesn't convenient me. It's not convenient for me. I'm inconvenienced to put this on when I'm out places. And here's the reality of it. There are people, listen guys, that are scared to death of the virus. And we know that's no attitude, right, to have if we know the Lord. But nonetheless, that's how people are. So you know what that means? Look at me, guys. That means that you and I get a unique privilege and opportunity to demonstrate that we care and we are sympathetic towards people that are fearful by putting on a stupid mask, right? That means this, that wearing a face mask, even if it's inconvenient for you, may be an opportunity for the gospel. That's what it means to filter these things through the gospel. It's saying, okay, how can I use this as an opportunity to love people and to tell them about Jesus rather than just thinking about how convenient it is for me? You know? That's what Paul's doing here. He's saying, look, man, this is totally inconvenient for me, but I'm willing to go through it for the sake of the gospel because it's furthering it. The gospel dictated his perspective. Secondly, I love this, man. It also transformed his relationships. It transformed his relationships. Read verses 13 and 14 with me. He says this, and it's really an explanation. He says, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. And many of the brethren in the Lord, that waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Without fear. Really, again, these two verses are really an explanation of what he's already said about the furthering of the gospel. He's saying, here's what it looks like. Here's how it happened. And here's what he said. He said, it's further the gospel because, listen, guys, he says that everyone around me and everyone in the palace and everyone everywhere, they know that the only reason I'm suffering is because of Jesus. What a testimony. What a testimony. And then he goes on to say, not only does it affect the people that are hearing the gospel, but also it affects the church and how they are filled with courage, right? He says, and my brothers are hearing about my sacrifice, my suffering, and as a result, they're growing more bold to share their faith. More bold to share their faith. I love this, man. Because here's what we see, like we can break that down and talk about it all day, but we're really getting insight into this. Stick with me, guys. Stay with me. We're really getting insight into how Paul viewed certain aspects of his relationship with others, towards others. The first thing we see is this, how he viewed his enemies. Say, Austin, I don't see that anywhere. It's really cool. Check this out. You see that word palace if you're reading the King James Version? It's a very interesting, unique term, that word palace. In fact, it actually means the word Praetorian. If you're reading a modern translation, it might say like the Praetorian or the Praetorian Guard. Right? Here's what it actually means. This Praetorian, it has a couple of old school meanings, but it's always one of two things, okay? It is either a reference to a place or a reference to a group of people, okay? If it's a reference to a place, here's what it means. It actually means, first and foremost, most commonly, that it was like a general's headquarters or his camp, right? Like that's where the general and his closest people, that's where they resided. It also could mean a general's residence, right? But it actually kind of transformed to meaning this. Ready? The dwelling place of someone of wealth and influence. That's what it meant, right? But it also can mean a group of people, and here's what I love about it, man. Here in this context is actually a reference, we believe, based off the text, to what's called the Praetorian Guard. Anybody ever heard of the Praetorian Guard? These are like the coolest dudes of Rome, okay? Outside of the gladiators, perhaps, right? Old school stuff. The Praetorian Guard were this. They were hand-selected guards. They were the imperial guard of Rome, essentially, right? Created by Caesar Augustus. He instituted them, and there were 10,000 of them at the point of when they started, and they actually grew to be a whole lot more. You can read about their history. They had a lot of influence in ancient Rome. It's really cool to read about them. But here's essentially what Paul is saying. He's saying this: because of my placement, because of my suffering in Christ, everybody in the imperial guard has heard about the gospel. What? And he says, and even outside, all other places. Look at me, man. He's psyched about this, dude. He's pumped for this, right? He's excited that the people who are keeping him in prison are hearing the good news, right? Does that not blow your mind, right? Like he's actually thrilled that these people are getting a chance to hear the gospel. The people that are keeping him there, right? Now we know that when Paul was imprisoned in Rome, he wasn't in a prison cell. He was actually given the advantage of being able to rent out lodging somewhere, right? But here's the catch. Even if he rented it out somewhere, there was always a guard with him. And actually they took shifts. And he wasn't really allowed to leave. People could come visit him, but he couldn't really leave. And here's what happened, dude. As people came to visit Paul, they heard him talking about Jesus. No doubt. And as a result, man, the gospel spread throughout the imperial guard. The people responsible for his suffering are the ones he's thrilled about hearing about it. Right? Not only that, does it show us how he viewed his enemies, it also shows us how he influenced his allies. I love this, man. Read verse 14 again. It says, and many of the brethren in the Lord, they waxed confident. They grew confident in my bonds and are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Right? I love this, man. He says that because of his suffering, his Christian friends, they got more bold. Look at me, guys. If you and I are in prison unjustly, and I got friends on the outside and I can communicate with them, you know what I'm going to be saying? Bro, get me out of here, right? Get me out of here. Get a petition going. Go talk to somebody. Go do whatever you got. Go start a GoFundMe, right? Get me out of here, right? Do whatever you got to do because I don't deserve to be here. And yet here he is saying, man, everyone in the imperial guard is hearing about it, but even outside, all of my friends, they're growing more confident because of what they're seeing me do, right? And it's transforming his relationships. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but listen, guys, this is very important for the series, man. Very important. Listen, people watch how you suffer. People watch how you respond to the difficult things you're going through. They do. Like people are taking notice of that. And Paul said this: if I'm going to suffer, I'm going to make good on it, right? I'm going to make sure people are hearing about Jesus. I'm going to make sure that my friends are being more bold because of it. How do you respond in suffering? If people watched you the past 6 months in the craziness of 2020, are they going to say, that dude cares about the gospel? Probably not. Probably not, right? Like most of us. Question is, how are you currently influencing people in the midst of your trials? Because they watch, man. Take advantage of it for the gospel. And then we move on, man, and we're going to wrap this thing up, I promise, in a big one. The good news, it also overshadowed his reputation. Oh, this is important, man. This is important. Read verse 15 down to verse 18, the beginning of verse 18 with me. Paul says this. He says, some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing, look at this, to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. What then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. Here's what he's saying, man. I love this. He makes a really interesting comparison here between two people, and I'll just briefly break it down for you so you can understand what he's saying. Paul's saying, hey, man, I know that there are people outside that are preaching Jesus for a lot of different reasons. He says some of them are preaching out of envy and out of strife, right? Not sincerely, not authentically, but out of contention. He even says this, to add affliction to my bonds. We'll talk about that in a second. He said there's also this other group, they're preaching Christ, so that way they can identify with me in my bonds. They're doing it out of love, with sincerity. And you know what he said at the end of it? He says, either way, whether they are trying to hurt me or whether they're just being sincere, Christ is being preached, and I'm content with that. Whoa, back up. Here's what's actually happening here. This word here for contention about these people that are trying to afflict him, it's the word arethia, which literally means strife or to provoke. However, it was originally used to mean this, working for pay. You're like, that's totally different. Yeah, it is, right? Welcome to ancient Greek, right? And here's what it originally meant, working for pay. It meant this, that you did things out of the lowest possible motivation like that exists. You did things for the lowest reasons, right? It actually developed into a political term, right? Meaning this, that you were canvassing for office. You guys know what that's like, right? 2020 United States, bro. Drive around the block, you're going to see canvassing for political office, right? People trying to promote themselves. That's what it means here. And so I like to think about it this way. Anybody in here, let's think about it in terms of football. Anybody like football? All two of us. Thank you guys. I love you guys liking football. Everybody else wake up, right? Football, yeah, you guys love football. Have you ever seen an instance, all you ladies are like, or some of you ladies are like, no, I don't. Anyways, we'll get past that. These instances where there's a backup quarterback who rides the bench for like 5 years, 6 years, right? And everybody's like, oh yeah, there's that guy, right? He's kind of a laughing joke, right? Like you're good and all, but you're just not good enough. But then what happens is one day, starting quarterback gets hurt, right? And everybody looks to the backup quarterback. What is the backup quarterback thinking in that circumstance? Well, most of the time, if he's not very confident, he's going to think, oh boy, right? But if he's in the NFL, you know what he's thinking? He's thinking, this is my chance, bro. You know what he's saying? He's saying, this is my chance. The dude who stood in my way, right? The dude who got in my way for this starting position, he's gone. He's hurt. I'm going to capitalize on this dude's injury, right? That's how people think, right? They're like, man, this is my chance. I got to show them what I'm made of. That's exactly what's happening here, only like spiritually. There's a group of men who are like, Paul's awesome and stuff, but he's kind of down right now. He's in prison. And so I'm going to use this time to add affliction to his bonds, meaning this, that I'm going to try to make his legacy less, and I'm going to try to grow my name more. That's what they're getting to, right? That's what they're getting to. And I love this, man, because Paul, look at me. He didn't even care. Paul was like, I don't really care what you're trying to do with my reputation. He says, I know what God is doing through me. I know what God is doing for me. I don't care what you do to my name out there. You know why? Because listen, Paul was a lot more concerned with the exaltation of Jesus' name than he was his own. Because he'd been transformed by the gospel. And it overshadowed his identity. You know what I mean? He didn't look for identity in his ability to preach or anything like that. Man, he wanted to be a tool for the Lord, right? A tool in the hands of God. And as a result, man, he didn't care about what happened. And I love it, man. I love the lessons. We don't have time. I've got extra notes, but man, we don't have time for them tonight. Jump with me to verse number 18, the first part. And here's what we're going to see. Not only did the good news overshadow his reputation, it also transcended his controversies. And we're almost done, man. Verse 18, look at the first part. He says, what then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. Can I summarize that for you? He says this, I know that there are people who disagree with me. I know that there are people out there doing things that I don't appreciate. I know that there are people out there living in ways, preaching the gospel in ways that I really don't like. I don't agree with. You know what he says? But the gospel's still going out, and I'm going to rejoice in that. You know what that meant? That meant this. Paul didn't have to agree, even with their intentions, in order to rejoice in their ministry, in what they were doing. Oh, if there is ever a timely lesson for our world, it is this. The fact that you can actually support someone even while disagreeing with them. That's exactly what Paul is doing. He's saying, look, man, I know you guys are trying to hurt me, but I don't really care. To be honest, you guys are talking about Jesus, and that's what matters. Man, I wish we could learn that practice. Instead, what happens is this. The church has a reputation as being pretty quickly disagreeable. Right? Don't believe me? Get on social media the past 6 months. Right? Look at the way we talk to each other. Look at the way we argue about politics and argue about masks and argue about this and argue about that. People see that. You know what they see? They don't see that we have anything in common. Rather, we just get at each other's throats. And the reality is, because of the gospel, listen to me, if you are in Christ, if you are a child of God, you and I will always have more in common than we will ever have that separates us. That's the reality of it. And Paul said, although these people are trying to hurt me, man, they're preaching the gospel, and I can live with that. I can live with that. Man, right? Pick and choose your battles. And it's not that these disagreements aren't important, right? It's that they're not most important. And Paul knew that. He knew that. And that's why he exalted the gospel above it. And then lastly, guys, it also, the good news, it supplied his joy. Look what he says. Christ is preached, and therein do rejoice. And yes, I will rejoice. See, the good news of Jesus wasn't just good news for Paul, right? He found joy in the fact that other people get to hear it. He says, Christ is being exalted, Christ is being preached, and therefore I find joy in that. That's what he rejoiced in, Jesus being proclaimed, in the gospel being preached. Here's what I love about it, man. Paul understood something. I'm wrapping up, I promise. That even in difficult times, even in a pandemic, even in amongst protests and riots, even during an election, even during a heartbreak, even during a loss of someone we love, listen, that the good news is still good. The gospel is still good news regardless of what we're going through. And because of that, we have reason to rejoice. Right? For the fact that we know it. The fact that we've heard it. Also for the fact that people around the world are still hearing it for the first time and they're trusting Jesus. There's something to rejoice about in that. And Paul knew that, man. He knew it. And the truth is, as I wrap this up, the truth is, everything I'm painting up there looks like a really picture-perfect Christian that most of us fail to meet. And I think I know where that starts. Most of us fail to rejoice in the gospel, right? How many times this week have you just fallen on your face saying, God, thank you for Jesus? How many times this week have you said, God, thank you for the fact that you have called people to share the good news around the world? Has that come across your mind at all? Do you rejoice in the gospel? What Christ has done for you, what he's doing through you? The reality is, if you're like me, you probably struggle with it. And the reality, it's very simple, and here's why. And I'll just summarize it this way. For far too many of us, listen, the good news has become old news. Tonight I've said all of this stuff about how the gospel transforms and how it changes our lives. How it changes our lives. And so many of us sat in here tonight and said, man, I've heard this before. Austin, I know, I've heard that. I get it. Reality is, for so many of us, the good news has become old news. The truth is, we fail to rejoice in the gospel, not because it is no longer good news, but because it has become old news to us. We get used to hearing about Jesus. We get used to hearing about the cross. We get used to hearing about redemption. We get used to hearing about forgiveness, and it loses its effect in our hearts. Look at me, guys. Man, get out of that place. Think about the gospel. Every day. Let it be a point of rejoicing for you. A point of rejoicing. Because what happens is when it becomes old news, here's what happens. We entirely forget where we'd be without it. Right? We do. Most of us didn't wake up today and never crossed our minds that if Jesus were not who he said he was, and if he did not do what he did, that you and I would stand eternally condemned before a holy God, condemned to a real place called hell. with no hope of escaping it. Like, these things don't come across our minds throughout the day, but we've got to make sure they do. We've got to preach that gospel all the time because it's something we can't forget. It's something we can't grow old of, right? Because when it does grow old, we forget it. And secondly, not only do we forget it, but we entirely neglect to share it. Listen, y'all, and I'm done. Tonight, as you and I go to sleep in a couple of hours, or for some of you, maybe hours from now, whatever, right? Almost 3 billion people around the world. Almost 3 billion people around the world will go to sleep tonight without having ever heard the name of Jesus. Right? Why is that? How come we can get on a plane and be on the other side of the world in 15 hours, but people still don't know about Jesus? It's because it's gotten old to us. We're used to it. We don't rest in it. We don't think on it. We don't rejoice in it. Listen, guys. Make sure that the good news stays that. Right? Make sure it doesn't become old news in your life. Because I promise, God will do incredible things. It doesn't take a lot. Remember what God has done for you. Remember the sacrifice of Jesus, the fact that we have redemption through His blood. Remember that. Think on that. Share that. Rejoice in that. Because regardless of what's happening in our world, regardless of what's happening in your life, regardless of the serious trials and struggles you may be facing tonight, the good news is still very good. And it's still worth rejoicing in.